Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Some 35 years ago this March, a brave young 28-year-old from Williams Lake, British Columbia, embarked on a tour with a wheelchair that would take him across continents and around the world and across Canada. He was determined to raise awareness in Canada and around the world for persons with disabilities, and particularly persons with spinal damage, and also to raise funds for research. In the course of that time, he followed a 40,000 kilometer trek across 34 countries and 4 continents before returning to Canada and crossing Canada in a wheelchair as well. When you consider the list of Canadians who've inspired generations over the course of our history, there's probably no one who would come closer to the top of that list than Rick Hansen. He's educated Canadians about the role that persons with disabilities can play in our society and economy. He's inspired us to deal with adversity. He has raised money for research, and he is the president and CEO of the Rick Hansen Foundation, which has raised some $200 million already for spinal cord injury programs. An extraordinary Canadian and someone I'm very proud to be able to welcome today. Rick, it's very good to have you here with us. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's an honor. Thanks, Perrin. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're into the 4th week now of lockdown for many Canadians, and people are feeling it. They're anxious. We're all feeling cabin fever. But for persons with disabilities, there've got to be special challenges here as well. What should we be looking at in terms of, first of all, the special issues that they have to deal with during a time of lockdown? And particularly, what should employers be looking at in terms of meeting the needs of their employees who may have disabilities?
Yeah, Perrin, this is a really devastating time for Canadians and for people around the world. It truly is a global trauma and crisis, one like we've never really seen before. Her Majesty summed it up in making the analogy towards World War II, where people were really forced to make sacrifices for the good of the whole. And the difference being, instead of nations fighting each other, we're all unified in fighting this virus and this pandemic. And the consequences are massive. We have so many people who have lost lives, loved ones who are sick and ill. There are people who are currently living in fear, and then others who are being called to action on the front lines, our healthcare professionals, the authorities, our government leaders, our corporate and private sector leaders, our social leaders, everybody doing their part. And even those who are asked to quarantine and self-isolate are doing their part by making that appropriate sacrifice to ensure that we flatten out this curve and get past it and move on to a new normal. People with disabilities during this time are often overlooked, and it's really a test to the fabric of a nation and its values and its policies and procedures to see how far we've come in becoming accessible and inclusive for all citizens. And the things that can be overlooked are the simple things. First of all, most importantly, when there's communications, the leaders, that we look to for vital information, right from our Prime Minister all the way down to our municipal leaders and health authority leaders. They're looking for plain communication in plain language and alternate formats so that people who are perhaps deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually challenged, or those who have cognitive challenges, or those people who are just looking for the simplicity and the potency of that information. That is so vital, and the accessibility of that information. The other thing that's important to consider, Perrin, is that when we create these measures, our ability to consider when we're asking people to constantly wash their hands and have access to sanitary facilities. If these facilities aren't accessible, then an individual with a disability is constantly doubly challenged just trying to do that. If you're in a wheelchair, you're much lower than anyone else, and so the trajectory of contaminants is much more aligned towards the flow of the individual. Contact with wheels, the ability to push automatic door openers or seek that that sort of touch to be able to gain access and mobility. And then lastly is the ability to make sure that you all are self-isolated, when in reality some people with disabilities are very dependent upon close contact, personal support, attendant care, and that worry of ensuring that there's the appropriate protocols in place for transmission protection. And the other issue would be then the worry of the appropriate supply of family, friends, and care workers to be able to be there in support. And then lastly, isolation can be devastating, in the best of times. And in this period of time when we're all asking others to be self-isolating, people with disabilities can be most vulnerable, and so the need for contact and in connection, compassion, caring, and that social sense of belonging has never been more important. And so even our healthcare facilities, as we treat people with various disabling conditions, need to be considered with the utmost level of accessibility and inclusion. And even lastly, is there are some fears in some nations where there's been perhaps inappropriate decisions about who gets certain access to most vital life-saving equipment, and that triage effect. And so, that really forces us to challenge at every level how people with disabilities can be included respectfully, with dignity, as equals, and not marginalized, not left out, and then not obviously subjugated to old values and stigmas.
One of the great concerns I think that we have about anyone who has to be isolated is the issue of mental health. Just the tremendous strain that there is. People are worried about whether they'll have a job. They're worried about whether they'll catch the disease. They're worried about whether anybody will be able to look after them if they have that. They're missing family and friends. As you point out, often for persons with disabilities, they are isolated to begin with, and they're faced now with an even greater degree of isolation. Are mental health issues a particular concern here for persons with disabilities because of the stresses?
There's no question. Mental health is a major factor in everyday life for so many millions of Canadians, and then you, of course, don't separate that for people who have varying disabilities, and now you magnify the issues, and it accelerates the sense of fear, stress, anxiety, depression, and other aspects of mental health. And being armed with the appropriate information, taking fear out of the dark and into the light so it can be analyzed, getting access to the facts, arm yourself with the appropriate information and knowledge to be in control and be a self-advocate, and to be able to know where the resources are, both in terms of human and technical, to lean on during challenging times, and ultimately to seek support when we need it most, so that we're not dealing with these issues of mental health in isolation, and not being afraid to label it, and call it when we're really struggling. And this is part of the journey of our country, is to be able to normalize mental health, and to allow people to speak about it when it's relevant, and seek the support that they need. And I think for all of us, it also makes us realize during this period more than ever the false notions of fierce independence, and that everything is based on what I do alone by myself. And in reality, we are so interdependent as humans, as a social society globally. And I think it's a sign of strength when we can become the CEOs of our life and reach out to lean on others when we need it most.
If you're advising employers, what should they be looking at in dealing with their employees who may have disabilities? Are there special measures that they can put in place during this period of working remotely?
Well, first of all, in businesses that are still active and have appropriate measures in place, the ability to have accessible workplaces is critical, both in their existing geographic locations, and then in this massive move towards working remotely. I think it's going to be a very interesting reality, Perrin, that there's been tremendous efforts by employers to help people in general, their employees, to be able to work remotely and to have health measures in place when it is needed most. And people with disabilities, of course, require that same consideration. Technology, though, has been a tremendous enabler for so many people with disabilities. And often it's been the policies of employers that have been handicappers. They perhaps have been maybe more restrictive and conservative about the value of flexible work environments, working remotely, flexible hours, considering some of the complicating impacts of one's either health or ability or even social construct. These things are being challenged, and now they're becoming more normalized. And so this is a powerful opportunity for people with disabilities to be included in this work environment, to be enabled with the assistance of technology in so many different forms. And of course, if they have that appropriate work accommodation support, which is relatively minor, they can maximize their ability to contribute and constantly stay engaged. The real interesting thing will be when we start to settle from this emergent issue and crisis, and we start to think about the long-term reality is that as we've had these experiences of social isolation and self-imposed, obviously, or socially imposed, but we have the freedom to then go back into our inclusive worlds. We should remember that we've now experienced the world of a person with a disability who perhaps has been socially isolated by artificial constructs and barriers, and really have that sense of empathy and try to help do our part to not leave them behind and break down those barriers, and also to be able to ensure that people with disabilities have a chance to access these abilities to contribute in the workplace remotely, and to have flexible opportunities to still work their magic. And I think that will help mobilize that 500,000 people who are ready, willing, and able to work at a time when perhaps we need people to do whatever we can to infuse energy into our economy and add innovation and ideas and talent and capacity.
It's an important point that you make, that we should be much more aware and empathetic as a result of this experience. We are starting to live in a small way something of the experience that persons with disabilities may have as part of their everyday lives. And if that helps us to become more aware and more sympathetic and more responsive to those needs, that's something that it's actually good that can come out of this. I'm also
That's true, and it's a hallmark of a smart and capable business leader. You stay close to your employers in a way, and your employees, and what you do is you stay close to your customers and your community. And if you set policies, they might have good intention, but they could also sometimes be well-intentioned general ideas that sometimes handicap the outliers. And if we're open, policies don't drive us. They're meant as a frame, and then we use common sense. For instance, some employers have been really awesome in thinking that they would allow the elderly and those who are disabled to have early morning access to shopping opportunities, and where they can be better served, which is a tremendous policy initiative. However, there are, you can imagine if you're a high lesion quadriplegic who needs incredible, intensive attendant care support to be able to get dressed, to literally spend 2 hours to be able to get up into the wheelchair in the morning, and then create and access parallel transit to be able to get to the shopping location. The individual who's being benefited from the policy would have to get up at 4 in the morning, disrupt their sleep, stress their health, and ultimately make them more vulnerable to the very thing we're trying to protect them from.
So
and
unconsciously
so,
make problems even worse.
correct. And so it doesn't mean that you change the policy. It means perhaps you have some flexibility so that people can actually still receive that same incredible intention, just that we're thinking about customized solutions with our customers and bringing them into the best place to be able to be served.
I'm struck, Rick, by the fact that even with us just having experienced this now for a few weeks, none of our organizations are going to be the same afterward. We've discovered, for example, the ability to work remotely. The Canadian Chamber will be much more flexible in terms of how we design ourselves in the future. The fact that you and I are able to talk using video conferencing facilities, this is going to be something we'll be using much more. And I think every business organization is going to be doing that. Do you see an upside coming out of this that, for example, that organizations are going to recognize that we can plug in people with disabilities working from home and make them part of the team? That it wasn't that long ago that you would have been hearing from your family doctor that if you wanted a prescription renewed, that you'd have to drive in and see them. Don't call them on the phone. Now you're getting emails saying, don't come anywhere near our office. We'll handle this remotely. So telemedicine is an example of something that might be of tremendous advantage for people living in rural and remote areas, for seniors, for persons with disabilities. Do you see areas where this experience may help us to actually serve the needs of persons with disabilities better than before?
Well, there's no question, Perrin. There's going to be, like in any challenge, there's adversity and pain and suffering, and then of course there's opportunity. And in this, we're going to be stressing our systems and asking people to innovate and consider what's an emergent response that needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, or something that actually disrupts the way in which we do business and creates new opportunities in the healthcare system. The tsunami of aging boomers will overrun our system if we're not innovating constantly. Our billing systems are archaic approaches towards one-on-one services, tying up specialists when there's really no need, bringing in people to doctors' offices when a simple telephone call could, with some biometric supports, could help arm a doctor to treat someone quickly and efficiently, and ultimately be able to help transform that backlog, open up people's ability to deal with more urgent issues, and keep the system moving forward and unclogged. And I think you'll see that for remote areas in the north, less people having to come down, into specialized care supports for something like a bladder infection, which can become septic. And can you imagine, anyone, perhaps either the elderly or who've had transplants or someone with spinal injury, just simply having a wand where they could do a metric on the oxygen level of their urine, which through the bladder, and they would be able to then look at it and send it to the doctor, and they would be able to say, look, you probably are brewing an infection. We'll get you a quick sample and then prescribe you an antibiotic, or even some earlier interventions before the antibiotic. And those would have massive impacts, because that person wouldn't go septic, wouldn't be then into emergency, wouldn't be tied up in weeks and weeks of life-saving intervention before they got back home. And of course, they wouldn't be then out of the workforce, and they'd still be contributing and be part of their family. So yes, on the telemedicine side, for sure, the way in which we deal with healthcare. Also, when we actually think about our workplace opportunities, people with disabilities, I think will be much more available in the workplace, and I think employers will be thinking of them as ready, willing, and able employees, and perhaps maybe more in touch with them. And lastly, they will see their perhaps aging workforce as potential people who have disabling conditions, and make accommodations easily, so they stay in the game longer, because we all know the cost of the transition of good employees early for reasons that can be prevented. And we all know the economics also, of the fact that by 2030, according to the Conference Board of Canada, we'll be seeing, some really powerful economic demographics, over $300 billion a year of consumer spending available in the disabled market, $17 billion to GDP, about $4 billion of tax revenue to governments. And these new innovative opportunities to serve with products and services also will help create that disruptive energy where people can think about, oh, this isn't a burden. This is like, if I'm putting my mind behind how to create something that will serve my customer or citizens better, maybe it's a Made in Canada global products and services innovation that helps drive the economy to a different level.
That's a massive market that you're talking about, and it certainly should be an incentive for business to innovate and look for ways to make products that serve a specific need. So it's something and it's a growth market. It's not one that's going away. It's one that's continuing to grow.
Truly, yeah, and it's all perspective, isn't it? And so the more aware we are, and it again starts with the top. People who own small or medium or even large businesses, government employees, and managers, people in the social sector. We should think about our metrics and consider this as a horizontal metrics-driven requirement. So if we meet the checklist in this regard, we'll probably be a better performing company with a better bottom line. We'll have better morale and employee, satisfaction, and we'll have better customer and community identification. And so that's what we want.
A minute ago, you talked about the importance of overcoming adversity, and that was the final topic I wanted to address with you today. There's nobody who knows more about overcoming adversity than you. Your accident, which confined you to a wheelchair, you were 15 years of age. And just a few years later, you had, I was going to say the vision, many people would have said the foolishness to consider getting into a wheelchair and taking yourself around the world. Just incredible vision and courage. One of my favorite, when you came and made a presentation to the Canadian Chamber's AGM in Fredericton a few years ago, one of my favorite elements in the presentation was a shot that you had when you left the launch of the Man in Motion tour, which was at a shopping center in Vancouver. And as you were going out, you passed under a bridge in the camper van that you had. The box that you had on the top with your only spare wheelchair came smashing off, and you had lost that wheelchair. Then you continued around in the most adverse political and climactic conditions you could possibly imagine, including as you were going across Canada under exceptionally difficult circumstances. And yet you never left, you never believed that you couldn't do it. You just kept moving forward. Tell us about overcoming adversity. Any problems that we're facing at this point compared to what you had to overcome are tiny. How did you manage to do that?
Perrin, adversity is a relative thing for all of us. And, we can have these visible challenges that are obvious. And then maybe there's these not so visible challenges that we're facing every day that are equally or even more devastating. I also think that trauma is something that it's an insidious reality that happens in many different forms. And in many ways, we're facing a trauma where in one moment, world is moving in a certain direction, and it's predictable and seems linear, and all of a sudden, out of the blue comes this impact. And when a trauma hits us, it's devastating and it's disorienting. And it can happen in different ways. People can brush it off and ignore it and move on, but sometimes it can soak and trip you up down the road. Others, it can paralyze individuals immediately and they're completely overwhelmed. Others in between somewhere. The key is to acknowledge that this is a serious issue and something big is happening, and then comes the real art of taking it seriously, being able to arm yourself with as much information as possible in this new and foreign world, to analyze that and to give yourself the information about what to do and how to handle it and who to lean on. Being able to engage, for me as a 15-year-old in this new world, there's no way that I could have even begin to cope or adapt if I hadn't been exposed to role models, people who would give me a sense of this new reality and what I could do as opposed to what I couldn't do. Focus on ability, arm myself with what I could do and where my potential still was. Be able to set baby goals, and I'll never forget being confined to a horizontal bed for 2 months in 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 a hospital at the age of 15, being flipped face down, face up every 3 hours in the middle of summer from June the 27th right through until my birthday on August the 26th. And how did I even begin to deal with that? And for me, it was one moment at a time, one day at a time, trying to just find hope. And hope is the most important enduring factor for all of us when we're facing a trauma or a crisis. Hope of that we will see a better day. There will be a better world, that we will emerge through this. And the good things inside of the pain and the suffering and the loss can still emerge. And yet still also be able to talk about the pain and the suffering, and to be able to get it out, and to share, and to make people realize that you are having difficulties, and the role models that come in, they populate your world with new possibilities and new dreams. And so the resilience of not giving up, having hope, buckling down, setting baby goals. And for me, it was working my arms, and I couldn't use my legs; they weren't working. And then it was getting out of that horizontal bed, and up into a normal bed for my 16th birthday, and celebrating that victory, and then getting out of the bed and into a wheelchair, even analyzing my view of the wheelchair, which was laden with stigma, that it was a symbol of disability, and then seeing it as my chariot for the future and my opportunity to go and live life to its fullest, to get back in motion again. Thinking about being an athlete still being possible, instead of using my legs, using my arms, and being driven by my heart. And nowhere in the definition of an athlete does it say you have to use your legs in order to be one. And then if you move through this process, you can also realize that you're not alone, and you've been impacted by so many people: your family, your friends, people in the healthcare profession, mentors in the social sector, others, your teachers, your teammates, and you're compelled to also pay it forward and know the value of that, which is what inspired me, Perrin, to then think about using my athletic talents and my experiences to wheel around the world and try to make a difference, to try to remove barriers. And in reality, that dream would have never happened without the amazing support of so many people who played their role, small or large. And people often ask me, how did I wheel around the world? And it was by breaking through the barriers, the fears, the skepticism, the self-doubt, the fears of not only failure or success, but also the fears of the unknown, and taking those first couple of strokes out of Oak Ridge Mall, in spite of the crazy things that happened with the motorhome and the box, and yet knowing that that we were committed, and one stroke at a time, one day at a time, 113 kilometers a day, day in, day out. And eventually, 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days later, we were on the other side of that crazy, challenging and seemingly desperate journey to one of triumph and joy and impact, and feeling like the dream and reality were the same. And I believe that the metaphors, in either dealing with a trauma or pursuing a goal or a dream, are never more relevant in today's world. And it's my hope that if we all share some of our collective stories, that we can remind people of the simplest things in these confusing times, and encourage people to keep striving, overcoming fears, and giving themselves the ability to arm with daily goals and make meaning of this time, and then to not forget about others, and to reach out and to do our appropriate duties and acts of kindness and support, because we are all interdependent.
You talked earlier about making a difference, and that you certainly have done for so many Canadians. Olympian, Order of Canada recipient, champion for the disabled, inspiration for all Canadians. Rick Hansen, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks, Perrin. Let's just keep moving forward one day at a time, man.
We'll do that. Thank you.
All the best to you.